The war had already ended for them before the fighting truly stopped. By the summer of 1943, Italian soldiers in North Africa understood what their officers refused to admit, that Rome's alliance with Berlin was a pact with collapse. When Mussolini fell and the Allies swept across Sicily, the choice became survival without ideology. Thousands surrendered not to soldiers, but to the machinery of capture. Processing camps, transport ships, detention compounds scattered across the American heartland. Salvatore Russo had been a captain in the 10th Army, a man accustomed to command, to being obeyed. The prison camp in Oklahoma stripped him of rank, but not of observation. He watched men unravel without purpose, without the anchor of orders. Years of fascist discipline had taught them that strength came from obedience, that freedom was chaos, that surrender meant erasure. They were wrong, but no one had told them. Then, in the camp recreation hall, an American soldier, bored, sympathetic, or simply routine, began screening films salvaged from base stock. Documentaries, comedies, dramas made in Hollywood before the war seemed like transmissions from another planet. What began as distraction became something more dangerous. A mirror held up to everything they'd been taught. One film changed everything. It wasn't propaganda. It was simply American. And in watching it, Salvatore understood that the war they'd fought wasn't really about territory or ideology. It was about who would decide what freedom meant. Chapter 1. The Order Without Purpose. The camp existed in a flat expanse of scrubland near Ardmore, a place where the land itself seemed indifferent to the men confined within it. Guard towers stood at each corner, pale wood against the Oklahoma sky, staffed by American soldiers who treated the Italian prisoners with a casualness that confused them. No brutality, no speeches, just routine. Salvatore stood in the compound at dawn, watching the dust settle from the previous day's wind. His uniform, still Italian, had faded to the color of dried clay. Around him, men moved without direction, some toward the latrines, some toward the mess hall, some simply to the fence to stand and stare at the horizon, as if the earth itself might collapse and release them. Major Giuseppe Torrenti approached, his face carved by 3 years of command and 6 months of captivity. Torrenti still carried himself like an officer, though his rank meant nothing here. The Americans had made that clear on arrival. Here, all prisoners were equal, all powerless. "They want volunteers," Torrenti said. "Work detail, clearing brush in the south sector." "For what purpose?" Salvatore asked. "Does it matter? It's work. It keeps men from falling into themselves." That was how they spoke now, in acknowledgement of necessity without hope. Fascism had taught them that men required hierarchy, purpose, direction. Without these, chaos. Salvatore had believed this. Many still did, but 6 months of watching men organize themselves without orders had introduced doubt like a crack in concrete. "I'll go," Salvatore said. The work detail took them beyond the main compound, where the fence seemed less a prison boundary than a formality. The American Guard, a corporal from Iowa named Fletcher, positioned himself on a rise and watched them work with the expression of someone observing insects. He didn't lecture them, didn't threaten, simply watched. Salvatore worked alongside younger men, conscripts from Naples, from Milan, from places whose names seemed like whispers from another lifetime. They cleared dried brush, stacked it, burned it. The labor was mindless, which was the point. A mind without purpose becomes dangerous to its owner. By afternoon, sweat had soaked through their uniforms. One of the younger men, barely 19, spoke quietly. "My father was in Rome when Mussolini fell," the boy said. "He said people danced in the streets." "People dancing means nothing," another prisoner responded. "Order means something." "Does it?" the boy asked. "We have order here. No one strikes us. We're fed. We have shelter. but none of us are happy. Happiness is irrelevant, Salvatore heard himself say, heard the old words, the old certainties, but they tasted like dust in his mouth. That night, Fletcher announced that a film would be shown in the recreation hall, an American film, something called Casablanca, made before the war. A captain in the Luftwaffe sat across from Salvatore at dinner. "It will be propaganda," the captain said with certainty. "They will show us how their system triumphs, how we are defeated." Salvatore said nothing, but he was already curious about what the Americans considered worth showing them. What did their propaganda look like? What truths did they think strong enough to reveal? He would find out, and in that finding everything would begin to shift. Chapter 2. The message in moving pictures. The recreation hall was crowded. Nearly 300 prisoners filled the wooden benches, a mass of faded uniforms and lean faces. The projector hummed, and the screen blazed white before the film began. No preamble, no introduction, just the story, unfolding in images that moved like memory. Salvatore had seen film before, fascist newsreels in Naples, celebrations of power, monuments to order. But this was different. This was about people, not systems, about choice, not command. He watched Humphrey Bogart's character, Rick, move through a bar in an occupied city, a man who had principles but kept them private. A man who appeared to care about nothing but actually cared about everything. The contradiction should have been impossible, but the film made it breathe. Around Salvatore, men leaned forward. Some whispered. Most simply watched. There was a scene, Salvatore would remember this scene for decades, where Rick made a choice that cost him everything. He chose principle over survival. And the film didn't punish him for it. It honored him. In fascist narrative, the individual who acts against command is a traitor, weak, destructive. Salvatore had been taught this, had enforced it. But Casablanca showed something else. That a man could be strong and moral, that sacrifice didn't diminish him, that freedom meant the right to choose what to sacrifice. When the film ended, the lights came up. For a long moment no one moved. Then quietly someone began to clap. A few hands. Then more. Not applause for performance, applause for permission, permission to believe that strength and conscience weren't enemies. Fletcher watched, expressionless, as the prisoners filed out into the night. Major Torrenti found Salvatore in the compound. In the darkness, his face was barely visible, but his voice carried the weight of realization. "Did you understand what we just saw?" Torrenti asked. "A film," Salvatore said. "No, a world, a different world, where a man can choose and still be a man." Torrenti paused. "They're not showing us propaganda, they're showing us freedom." Chapter 3. The crack in the foundation. The screenings became weekly. Films arrived by courier, and on Thursday nights, the recreation hall filled with prisoners who came to witness not entertainment, but something that felt like possibility. They watched It Happened One Night, a film where a woman defied her father's orders and found happiness. They watched Stagecoach, where the moral center of the story was a man society had condemned. Westerns, comedies, dramas, all of them circling the same theme, that the individual conscience mattered, that systems could be wrong, that obedience without moral judgment was the first step toward atrocity. One evening, after screening Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, a prisoner named Luciano, who had been a lawyer before conscription, approached Salvatore with visible agitation. "Do you realize what we've been?" Luciano said. "Not just defeated, inverted. We were taught that order requires the destruction of the individual. We were taught that strength is the ability to command obedience. But these films, these are made by people who believe the opposite. And they're strong. Look at their country. Look at what they're building. They're also at war," Salvatore countered, though the argument felt hollow. "Yes, and they're fighting it without asking their citizens to erase themselves. without requiring complete obedience. Look at the soldiers who guard us. They think for themselves. They have rank, but they have dignity. They're not machines. Salvatore wanted to disagree. Part of him still believed in the rigid architecture of command. But 6 months of observation, combined with the weekly schooling in American values that the films provided, had fractured something in him. He was not alone. Throughout the camp, the weekly screenings had become moments of reckoning. Men began to question not just the war, but the system that had sent them to fight it. Officers and enlisted men sat together, watching their certainties dissolve on screen. Major Torrenti called a meeting of the Italian officers, 20 men who had once held rank and authority, now equals in captivity. "The Americans are clever," one captain said. "This is psychological warfare. They're breaking our discipline. Or they're showing us the truth," another replied. Salvatore stood and spoke for the first time since his capture. "We were disciplined into believing that freedom was weakness. We taught our men that obedience was virtue. And we were wrong. These films aren't propaganda, they're confessions. The Americans are showing us who they are, and we're realizing they're stronger than we are, not because they command better, but because they trust better." The silence that followed was not agreement. It was recognition. Major Torrenti nodded slowly. "Then what do we do with this knowledge? We are prisoners. We have no choice." "We choose how we remember," Salvatore said. "When this war ends, we choose what we'll become. We can return to the old ways, or we can carry what we've learned here back to Italy." The meeting broke without resolution, but the seed had been planted. End of Chapter 3, CTA. If this story feels real to you, tell us in the comments. What would you have done in their place? Would you have questioned your own indoctrination, or would you have held to the order you knew? Chapter 4. The letters mail had always been rare in the camp. Letters were screened, censored, often delayed for weeks. But by autumn of 1943, a letter arrived for Salvatore from Naples, his sister's handwriting shaky with emotion. "The city was in chaos," she wrote. After Mussolini's fall, Rome was dividing, some regions aligned with the Allies, some trying to negotiate with the Germans, some simply trying to survive. Families were separated, men were disappearing. The rigid order that had governed Italy for 20 years was crumbling, leaving not freedom, but confusion. Salvatore read the letter in his bunk by the light of a dying bulb. Around him, other prisoners slept or lay awake in the dark, listening to the wind move across the Oklahoma plains. The film screenings had taught him to imagine a world where his sister could choose her own path, where she wasn't simply a vessel for state ideology. But the letter showed him the reality. Freedom without structure was its own kind of horror. He shared the letter with Major Torrenti, who read it twice. "This is what the films don't show," Torrenti said. "Freedom doesn't arrive complete. It arrives broken, chaotic, dangerous. People have to learn it, and most don't know how." "Then what was the point?" Salvatore asked. "If we're simply trading fascism for chaos?" "The point," Torrenti said carefully, "is that chaos offers possibility. Fascism offered only the illusion of security. At least in chaos, individuals can shape their own fate." The next film was Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, a story about an ordinary man fighting a corrupt system alone, nearly breaking under the weight of it. He fails, in a sense, but he doesn't surrender. He testifies, he speaks, he forces the system to acknowledge his conscience. When it ended, men wept, not from sadness, but from recognition. This was the real burden of freedom. Not the absence of order, but the weight of choosing what to do when order fails. Chapter 5. The guard who understood Fletcher, the American corporal, had been watching the transformation without comment. But one evening, after a screening of The Great Dictator, he approached Salvatore with something unusual. a conversation. "You speak English pretty well," Fletcher said. "Where'd you learn it?" "Before the war, I studied in university, languages." Fletcher nodded, seemed to make a decision. "I'm going to tell you something I probably shouldn't. My father was in the last war, the Great War. He came back believing that the next one would be worse, that technology had made killing more efficient, that unless something changed in how men thought about power, we'd destroy ourselves. Your father was wise," Salvatore said. "He was exhausted," Fletcher replied. "But yes, and when they stationed me here, watching Italian prisoners who'd been trained to believe that strength meant absolute obedience, I thought of him. So I talked to my lieutenant about the films. I asked if we could show you what we actually are, not what your propaganda says we are." "Why would you do that?" "Because when this war ends, and it will end, you know that Italian boys are going to come back to a devastated country. They'll have to rebuild. And if they've only learned how to obey, they can't rebuild. They'll just rebuild the same broken thing. But if they've learned that strength can be married to conscience, that freedom isn't chaos, then maybe they can build something different." Salvatore felt something shift in his chest. The Americans weren't trying to convert them. They were trying to free them, not from prison, but from the chains of unexamined obedience. "What happens when we're released?" Salvatore asked. "You go home. You tell your people what you saw. You live differently, that's all." Chapter 6. The test winter came early to Oklahoma, and with it came news. The camp administration announced that prisoners would be allowed to work on local farms, supervised, but outside the compound. It was a test, though of what, no one said explicitly. Salvatore and 30 other men were assigned to a ranch outside the camp perimeter. The work was hard, clearing land, repairing fences, preparing for spring planting. The American rancher, a man named Hollister who rarely spoke, watched them work with the same neutrality that Fletcher had shown. On the third day, Hollister left the prisoners unguarded for nearly an hour, just left them alone with tools and open land and a fence they could have crossed. The choice was unspoken but absolute. Not one man left. They could have run. Some had families in Mexico, in Central America. They could have disappeared, but they didn't. When Hollister returned, he nodded once, acknowledging what had happened. That night in the camp, Torrenti gathered the officers again. "We passed a test," Torrenti said. "Not the Americans' test. Our own. We were given freedom to choose, and we chose to stay. We chose not to betray trust." "We're still prisoners," someone said. "No," Torrenti replied. "We're something else now. Men who understand that freedom and responsibility are the same thing." The final film screening was scheduled for the following week. Fletcher approached Salvatore with unusual gravity. "It's going to be Sergeant York," Fletcher said, "about an American soldier in the last war who questioned orders and saved lives. But my lieutenant wants you to know something after you see it. The war in Europe is turning. The Allies are pushing from the west, the Soviets from the east. This camp will probably close within a year. You'll go home." Salvatore felt the weight of what Fletcher was saying, without him having to speak it directly. What you do with what you've learned matters. The film screened on a cold November night. Sergeant York was a man of conscience from the mountains of Tennessee who learned that obeying orders without moral examination was a form of cowardice. He learned that the individual conscience matters, and he lived, survived, was honored, was free. As the lights came up, Salvatore understood that this screening was different. It was the last message, the final instruction, the closing argument. End of Chapter 6, CTA. If this battle still echoes in your mind, hit like. It helps these untold memories stay alive. These men had to unlearn everything they were taught about power, and they chose conscience. What would you choose? Chapter 7. The Silence. After the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Salvatore heard the news in the camp, where American soldiers allowed the prisoners to celebrate. There was no bitterness, no recrimination, just acknowledgement that the fighting was over. He was released in July, transported to a port in New York, and placed on a ship bound for Naples. Around him were thousands of Italian prisoners returning to a country transformed by defeat and liberation simultaneously. As the ship moved into the Mediterranean, Salvatore stood on deck and watched the coastline emerge. The hills, the ancient ruins, the earth he'd been trained to die for and never to question. He had learned something in an Oklahoma prison camp that no officer had ever taught him. That strength could be quiet, that obedience without conscience was the first step toward atrocity, that freedom meant the terrible weight of choosing for yourself. Italy was broken, Rome was occupied, negotiating its future between allies and Americans and its own fractured people. There would be no easy restoration of the old order. There couldn't be, because the old order had been built on the lie that individual conscience was a weakness to be eliminated. When Salvatore reached Naples, he found his sister alive, his apartment damaged but standing. He carried with him the memory of 7 films, each one a whisper telling him that a different kind of strength was possible. He didn't speak of the camp often. He didn't explain in the years of rebuilding that followed that he'd learned more in captivity than he'd ever learned in command. But he lived differently. He listened to people, even those without rank. He questioned when others obeyed. He built things instead of commanding the building. And sometimes, on quiet nights, he thought of Fletcher, the American guard who understood that freedom wasn't something you could give someone. It was something you had to show them, through stories, through images, through the simple act of trusting them to choose. The war had ended, but the real war, the one fought in the conscience of men who had to decide what they would become, that war continued. And Italy, broken but beginning to heal, would be shaped by the choices men like Salvatore made in the silence after the noise stopped. In the end, that was the only victory that mattered.